I'm just a bit taken aback by the majority leader's decision to alter the course that I thought we were on that would allow for debate and work on a bill to deal with the budget, the debt ceiling, and our budget deficit tomorrow. And some of his comments that he made today after he changed his mind, yesterday he said, I'm committed to allowing a fair and full debate on this bill. I want the proponents and opponents to have time to air their views and so forth. Then he says, I think this piece of legislation is about as weak and senseless as anything that has ever come before the Senate. Quote, I'm not going to waste the Senate's time day after day on this piece of legislation, which I think is an anathema to what our country is about. And he goes on to say the American people should understand this is a bad piece of legislation, perhaps the worst legislation in the history of the country. That's what the majority leader said just a few hours ago. Let me ask Senator Lee, wouldn't you say that compared to all the other legislation that we're talking about passing, and some of it has some teeth to it, I acknowledge, but compared to all of that, a constitutional amendment that requires us to live within our means is certainly not a weak piece of legislation.
I would hardly call it weak. Quite to the contrary. Calls for legislation like this date back a couple of hundred years. Thomas Jefferson was arguably the first one to suggest this kind of proposal. He called for it again and again, and those calls have continued throughout most of our history, but they've accelerated in recent decades. They've accelerated because this body has refused to balance its budget, and it's abused its borrowing power to the point where we're now spending more than $1.5 trillion a year, more than we bring in every single year. It's bankrupting our country. We're burying our children under a mountain of debt. We're killing jobs. We're spending money we don't have, and that's wrong.
Now, for a constitutional amendment to pass, it has to have 2/3 vote in the Congress, both houses, and 3/4 of the states. But once passed, no majority leader could come in next year and say, well, yeah, I know I've been in favor of balanced budgets, but I don't want to do it this year. I got more spending I want to occur.
It's the whole purpose of the balanced budget amendment is to restrict our power and give that power back to the people where it belongs.
Somebody says, oh, you know, the Tea Party isn't angry. Well, why shouldn't they be angry? We've completely mismanaged the American people's business. We're elected to be responsible leaders. Nobody, I believe, would come to the floor of this Senate, I'd like to see it if it happens, and defend what we're doing. And I know you're familiar that the statutes of the United States require a budget. It doesn't say you go to jail if you don't, I'll admit, but it says we should have a budget. Don't you think the people in Utah, and I think the people in Alabama, would think we should have a budget because it's the right thing to do, number one, and number two, we should do it because it's the law?
It is the law, and notwithstanding the fact that we don't have a court order enjoining us to do that, we still have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. And I think that means that especially on an issue so fundamental, so important, so sweeping as the budgeting process, we should be complying with that law.
I think Senator Reid believes in the Senate. I think he respects the Senate. I really do. But I think he's under constant pressure, and they've decided that some of his members, I guess, didn't want to stay here this weekend. They wanted to go home. They had a speech they wanted to give, or a party they wanted to attend to, or a fundraising event they wanted to go to, so they don't want to stay here this weekend. Just yesterday, I think it was, Senator Reid was complaining about the House going home this weekend and promising we'd stay here and we'd work. Now, all of a sudden, anybody that stays here and wants to vote on a bill that passed by a substantial majority in the House of Representatives, he says is acting as he says the bill's an anathema to the Senate, and senseless and not worth our time to talk about.
Now look, we've responded. We've responded politely and well to his directive that we would stay here this weekend. We've made plans. We've canceled plans in our home states. And all of a sudden, his high and mighty speech earlier this week telling us we had to stay here is no longer important when he disagrees with some legislation we put forward.
They say that this is senseless. Well, do you have anything that raises the debt ceiling and does something about the debt of America? Does anybody else in the Senate, or if they bring it up, will they be blocked from bringing it up? I don't see it. The only legislation is this legislation. It's not senseless. It's very significant.